So once again, welcome and thanks for joining us for this SIGGRAPH Now webinar. My name is Josef Spjut. I'm the SIGGRAPH 2023 Games Focus Area Chair, and I work as a research scientist at NVIDIA working on esports and gaming technologies. It's great to be here with all of you today as we count down to SIGGRAPH this year. I'm excited to sit down with my friend and fellow SIGGRAPH 2023 presenter, Ben Watson, to discuss a popular and ever-evolving topic in the game space, esports. I can't wait to introduce you to Ben and to start a discussion. We hope today inspires you and that this discussion excites you about what you can experience at SIGGRAPH this year in Los Angeles and what's to come for the future of gaming. To everyone who's tuning in right now, please use the Zoom Q&A function to submit questions for our panelists as you think of them. And if you don't have any specific questions, you can upvote someone else's question by liking it within the Q&A window. We'll keep an eye on the Q&A throughout the discussion and pull up the Q&A around the 45-minute mark. We look forward to hearing all of your questions. Now, since we've got a good amount of participants in here, let's move to the discussion you're here for. And so, I'd like to welcome our panelist, Ben Watson. Ben, can you introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure thing, Joseph. It's really good to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I'm an associate professor of computer science at North Carolina State University in Raleigh, North Carolina. If I was going to introduce myself briefly in this context, I think I would say I started getting into computer gaming when I was about 8 or 9 in Los Angeles, right next to, pretty close to the convention center where the conference will happen. And I'll tell that story a little later. Tell more about it a little later.
Great. Anything else you want to say before we get into the questions?
Sure. Just before, at least once before I forget, I'll say that we're actually, with the collaboration of Joseph, we're leading some esports events that we encourage all y'all to attend. One is a workshop on esports research and what rendering can do to make esports better. And then also a unique thing, an experiment that is a tournament. So we're running a little Rocket League tournament that is actually also research at the same time. And we'd be super grateful if you all would keep your eyes peeled for an invitation to participate in that tournament. We have to recruit from among SIGGRAPH attendees, so we need to get the word out. Yeah.
Thanks for mentioning that. The information about that event should be going up on the SIGGRAPH webpage in the next couple weeks, I'm hoping.
Yeah.
So, yeah, keep your eyes out for that. Well, great. That's a great introduction. So let's get into a little Q&A here. So reflecting on the history of esports, it's kind of remarkable to note the varied origins from lands in the US around the late 90s and some of the early competitive gaming tournaments to South Korea with the huge StarCraft craze. And also the Europeans really embraced multiplayer online battle arenas like Dota. So all these esport communities incubated independently before emerging into the worldwide spectacle we see today. Ben, could you tell me a bit about your personal history with esports research?
Sure. So I haven't really gotten into esports research until the last few years. Actually, esports research itself is quite young and emerging. I have been doing various kinds of games research for many years, but honestly, I really began to pay close attention to it when an old colleague of mine at NVIDIA, one of your managers or bosses, Dave Lubke, said, "Hey, you should be doing esports research with, these guys, including you, Joseph, at NVIDIA." And the more I looked into it, the more excited I became, because I've always been interested in the interactive version of computer graphics and what we need to do to make sure people can perform well. whatever that means in gaming or elsewhere, when they're using 3D graphics. And so it seemed a very good fit.
Yeah, I agree. I'm glad you decided to get into the field of research. So since you mentioned you've been doing games related research for a number of years, in what areas of gaming have you seen the most evolution over the years, and what do you think may have led to that evolution?
Well, I'll go back to that story I hinted at the beginning. So I first got into gaming and really computing when my father, who worked in the industry in the 60s, brought home, I don't know how many of you have actually seen these, brought home a roll of paper on which his computer interaction was recorded, right? So that was back in the day when the terminal was the printer, and the printer used paper rolls instead of individual sheets of paper. And what he brought and showed me was an interaction with a pioneering text adventure game. And I think it was, later it became commercialized and called Zork, but I think it was called Adventure or something like that. And it was just floating around among the community on early deck machines, I think, PDP-11s, PDP-8s. And I remember reading this and I understood what it meant. It meant that the story was, I had control of the story. I could like direct the narrative, and I read the whole thing, and it felt like, you know, half a day. I don't know that it really was. But that really hooked me and got me excited about computers. And then the next sort of phase was, you know, what you would expect. The stealing my mother's change to go to the liquor store and play arcade games. So I played like Asteroids, Space Invaders more. And then I also, eventually we got an Atari console. And I remember what Activision used to be. It was a offshoot from Atari, where the developers made cartridges for the console, and played all those games. And that's really my deepest history. And then maybe the next point I would mention is the sort of LAN gaming that was going on when I was a grad student in our lab. Everybody was using, you know, $250,000 workstations to play Doom.
Money well spent.
Yeah, I wish I could say that I've been in esports itself all along, but I haven't. But I do have a deep history with gaming.
That's an interesting story. So those old computer game displays were actually rolls of paper coming out of the printer, right?
Yeah. So this is really ancient history now, but and it's even a little before my time. But initially, there was not, you know, the concept of something called a full screen text editor. That was a big innovation. And so you would you would interact on a single line at a time, because, you know, and that's all a printer can really do. And so even before CRTs, people would interact sort of like a teletype device with a keyboard and a printout. And so as you typed, it would be like, da, 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 you know,
yeah,
pounding out the ink.
It's interesting you mentioned Doom as well. I think I saw a YouTube video where somebody turned their printer into a display for playing Doom. And so the frame rate was just the page rate of the printer. Not exactly as good as, you know, the modern esports monitors with 240.
That's right.
FPS.
Yeah, speaking of latency, that's something. Yeah.
Great. Well, you're organizing this SIGGRAPH 2023 Frontiers workshop on rendering for esports. I'm excited to take a part in that discussion in Los Angeles. Without giving too much away to the audience, what can you share about how games and esports players use and interact with rendering techniques?
Sure. So the history of computer graphics more broadly is, at least until recently, a history of pursuit of what's called photorealism. So trying to make what the images that we create hopefully in real time, look as realistic or convincing, whatever you want to word you want to use, as possible. And that makes a lot of sense for movies, where the need to produce every frame quickly is much, much lower than it is in gaming. And so, but in computer gaming, that's still been a challenge. And I would say that of late, we're really beginning to achieve that. But more recently, I think it feels like there's beginning to be more, and you should chime in, Joseph, if you would like to offer some opinion, I think. But it feels like the game industry is becoming less enamored with really compelling imagery, and that there's beginning to be more of a return to sort of my days of computer gaming, where it's all about the play and the mechanics and the charm. And I would say that makes some sense, right? So you asked the question about the workshop. The general theme of the workshop is that for esports players, a lot of times less is more, right? So if they want to, if they're competing at a peak level, they want to win. And we mentioned latency a bit earlier. That's a really important element of performing well in esports, is being able to see what your opponent does and respond to it before they can, or at least as quickly as possible. And so if it takes longer for you to make a really compelling image, then it's going to take longer for your game to make the compelling image. Then it's going to take longer for the player to respond to whatever their opponent does. And so what we find, and actually we're doing research to really nail this down, but so far what we found is that gamers, especially esports players, turn off most of the features that the SIGGRAPH research community has worked so long to develop, so that they can respond more quickly. And so the question we're asking our speakers to address, and with the help of the participants as well, this is a very participatory event, we're asking them to address the question of how should we render for esports players, and more generally for game players? If it's not just making the most compelling image possible, what should it be? And how should we trade off the two conflicting goals of making really great images with really quick response times?
Yeah, that sounds great to me. You mentioned that there's this kind of desire for less in terms of graphic fidelity potentially among esports players. That I agree that seems to be the case, and there's kind of this bifurcation in the community where there's still like these AAA games that come out, and they're like trying to push the absolute best, the biggest, the kind of best quality photorealism that they can get to, and those tend to do pretty well in the market. They sell pretty well, but then there's these other games, these esports games that people come back to year after year. And these are the games that you see people logging the most hours playing throughout the whole year and across from year to year. So there seems to be a bit of a difference or a distinction in these two categories, right? Games like Counter-Strike have been around for over 20 years and have been played since the late 90s, early 2000s, all over the world. So you also mentioned stuff like latency. I'm sort of curious about this. What do you think it is about esports that makes that interactivity different than other types of games interactivity?
Sure. Great question. So I think that the crucial element in esports is competition. So not that there isn't some competition in other game genres, but it's really foregrounded in esports. And so whereas in most AAA games, a lot of them are single player games. And so, latencies, into maybe a few hundreds of milliseconds might be tolerable, so that you can get really compelling images and get a really rich visual experience. I would say, if I was going to make a comparison, I would say these AAA games are more like, they're not the same as, but they're more like movies, right? So they're trying to create a world and immerse you in it, create a really compelling narrative and move you through it. Whereas esports games are more about the actual competition, the interaction with your opponent, the strategies and the tactics that you and your team use to gain advantage. It's more like traditional sports in that sense. And so while latency matters with both, it really, really matters a lot in esports.
Yeah, that's a good point. Going back to your roll of paper, some games may be very immersive, telling a very nice story on the rows of text.
Yes.
But those are not likely to be esports, because you won't necessarily get that level of competition and direct interaction.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if this analogy is completely accurate, but I was thinking recently that you had mentioned esports titles are sort of, in some sense, venerable, right? Like they last a long time. People play them long after most AAA games have it past their lifetime, at least in the latest version. And I think that the question I'm asking is, I think that a lot, maybe not all, but a lot of the games, even outside of esports, that people remember fondly and that they continue to play throughout their lives are games that are more than just visuals. They're games that bring a lot of other really compelling elements. And usually that is somehow intertwined with interactivity, I would say.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Let me just add one more thing. The reason that I think esports games are so long lasting makes some sense if you compare them to traditional sports. So in a traditional sport, it would be sort of a chaos if the rules changed every 2 years or something. At least in an extensive way. And so you want a shared set of rules, a shared understanding, a shared place to come and compete with others. And if that is constantly changing, then it's really hard, for one thing, to get good, right? Because the ground is shifting constantly beneath you. Whereas, just imagine, for example, if soccer, for example, or baseball change the number of innings all the time. Or in soccer that they kept changing the size of the ball every couple of years. Nobody would be that good, and it would be sort of chaotic. And so there's a lot of benefit to a game that, if it wants to act as a sport, to being hesitant to change at the most, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. And if you look at the traditional sports, I think the rule changes that do happen tend to be like fairly minor adjustments to try to, slightly correct something.
Yes. And it's worthwhile reflecting on how, the fact that, as you say, so many esports titles are so old, and yet people continue to play them and are continually involved in them. And just by the fact, even if they were visually compelling when they were first built, some games, like you say, are 20 years old. They don't look that great anymore, but they're still compelling, right? People still play them.
They'll strap a new coat of paint on them every couple of years.
That's right. Yeah.
So are there any innovations you think have led to this increase in popularity of esports? And if so, what innovations would you ascribe to that?
Yeah, so in the old days, I think I heard you mention LAN parties. In the old days, in order to play with an opponent, you had to be there in person, essentially, right? So people would get together into a big room and connect physically their machines to one another with wires, and then they would play their opponents. But so the internet and its evolution to being able to support interactive play to that point, that was a crucial enabler for esports. And so today, esports is really a transnational phenomenon, right? So you'll have people playing one another from different continents. People don't really strongly identify with, at least in the esports play, with their nation, like they so often do in traditional sports. And so you'll have people who you're not even sure what they look like, but they might be famous, right? And so that connectivity has really been a crucial enabler and led to the explosion of gaming. Interestingly, though, and maybe this is still happening, but before the really great connectivity we enjoy today, the sort of regional gameplay led to very different kinds of cultures. And I wonder if that will begin disappearing as we go forward.
Yeah, so you're saying the internet, if I'm hearing you right, is kind of the big enabler here. And I guess you're hypothesizing that the sort of cliques that you might have had in different local groups, right? Where one neighborhood may develop a particular style of playing soccer, and a different one would develop a slightly different style. Those might happen differently once you've got these kind of global interconnected networks of people who continue to exchange ideas and styles of play. Yeah, that is interesting. And so then you end up with different divisions. For instance, there tend to be like a group of servers for North America, group of servers for Europe, a group of servers for Southeast Asia. And I've definitely seen esports communities talking about how, the meta game in certain games is completely different in these different regions. And they sort of they sort of will tend to rank the different regions as, you're only playing in North America, like you must not be as good, even though you're like the top ranked person in North America.
That's right.
The people in the Korean servers might say, you wouldn't even get into the top 5% of players here. Yeah.
And I think that I was speaking even further back, and I think today you're absolutely correct that servers, have different degrees of latency for players. So like if a player in the States tried to play on a Korean server, they would experience a lot of latency and be at a disadvantage. So that encourages players to play at their closest servers, to play in essence then with others in their region. And so there's still sort of a regionality to gameplay, but it's certainly not as strong as it used to be. Mm-hmm. Right. And so really you're only penalized when you're beginning to excel at esports play. When you're more of a novice in your play, a little latency is not going to make a big difference. But as you gain in expertise, latency is more and more important in your play, more and more important piece. So that does lead to, at least at the higher levels, differences in styles of play. Just for the benefit of any attendees who are not already into esports, when folks talk about meta, they're talking about strategy and tactics, so sort of the theory or methods of play beyond just the basic rules of play, right? So the kind of thing that experts watching traditional sports know, they're trying this approach with that approach, same sort of thing. So you'll get different strategies and styles of play, meta, in different regions.
Would you compare that to like in basketball, how you tend to have like a point guard, a guard, a center? Like these aren't necessarily built into the rules of the game, but they've sort of evolved as the standard way that you arrange your players.
Yeah, and some coaches, some teams in basketball will, for example, rely heavily on point guard play. Others will really emphasize play near the basket with big players. right? So some are sort of slow and dominant, and others are fast and quick, right? Similar sort of thing in esports play.
Yeah. I like the basketball example because they also number the positions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in basketball. And then in Dota, they also number their positions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know they had numbers, but I did know that in a lot of these games, there are certain roles that everybody plays on a team, similar to many other sports. Yeah.
Yeah, that one was just kind of funny to me once I started seeing the jargon on both sides. I don't know how common it is, but you know, I definitely hear that come up when people are talking real casually about basketball, and then the same thing came up when they were talking real casually about Dota.
Right. Yeah. So the internet is definitely one, and a big part of that too has been the streaming industry. So first of all, the internet enabled remote play, and so somebody should do do a study on how esports players how well they did during COVID when everybody was remote, because esports players were already quite remote. So my hypothesis would be that they did much better than most. But then the streaming industry. So even if you're not a player, the streaming industry has really increased the popularity of esports by bringing it to a much broader audience, much broader than most people even today still realize. And that, of course, is a feedback loop, right? So people who never heard of esports will see it online, and then they will become players, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yes, for some people, it's impossible to decouple streaming from esports. Like those two communities have so much overlap.
That's right. Yeah. It's a kind of unique too. It's innovating, and a lot of the innovations in esports streaming and broadcasting essentially are spreading to other broadcasting domains, right? So Twitch and YouTube didn't get its start with esports streaming, but both of them, Twitch started as largely esports and then has become used much more broadly, and then YouTube started, I would say, largely outside of esports and has become a big part of esports now.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, are you ready for a hard question?
Okay.
So I've read some recent reports that show a bit of a slowing in the growth of esports viewership. With the pandemic, things went up like pretty fast, and they were already rising pretty fast before that. But kind of in the last 2-3 years here, the rate of growth has slowed quite a bit. Do you think esports has reached its limit, or is there still room to grow?
That's an interesting question, and I would say that I would caution to say that I'm not a social or behavioral researcher, but I can speculate. I would say part of it is that, as you say, during the pandemic, growth accelerated, and I would say probably there's a natural sort of slowing in growth. It's still growing, but there's a slowing in growth after that sort of artificial bump, where everybody got new machines and new GPUs so that they could do what they needed to do online. I don't think that there's any reason. My guess is that there's no reason to expect that it will continue. Its growth will continue to slow, or that will stop growing altogether. I just don't understand why that would be the case. Unlike a lot of other games or a lot of other media, esports is truly international, and there's still a lot of the world that is only picking up, esports gaming. So I expect it to continue. The interesting thing is, how will you count it all, right? Because esports, like most industry, is changing. So as esports moves into the developing world, outside of Europe, outside of North America, outside of um, Japan and Korea and China, it's changing and becoming largely mobile. For example, most of computing as an industry is mobile in those other parts of the world, and gaming is going to become like that too. So today you're seeing a lot of the top titles are actually mobile titles, which is a new development, as I understand it, in the esports industry.
Yeah, I definitely haven't personally looked too much at the mobile esports titles. I'm aware that there are a number of big tournaments in places like Brazil, for instance, that are everyone's playing phone or tablet games all on touch screens. A very different style of interaction.
That's right. Right. Yeah. So for in general, speaking even more broadly, computing in the States means people think of a PC on a desk still. Even though everybody has a phone, when they think of a computer, they think of a PC on a desk. But in a lot of other countries, that just isn't true. The computer is the phone.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to bounce back to the topic we were just at right before this. So esports is not just a way to participate in gameplay. It also creates community by connecting players and even involving spectators, like you were talking about streaming before. What would you say is the big value in this experience with all these different people being connected?
I think that if I understood your question correctly, you're asking about the value of esports connecting people. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to say something sort of a little saccharine, but I really do think that connecting people together around shared interests is always a good thing. And esports is somewhat unique in connecting people internationally in real time, interactively, around a shared interest. And I think that's a great thing. It's creating a lot of international understanding and sympathy. And, I would say, I don't know what y'all's impression of today's media is, but it feels like a lot of bad news to me. But I would say esports is kind of a bright spot in that respect. You'll be communicating with others from other countries. And instead of thinking about all the disagreements you have, you're thinking about how you both love this game. So that's a good thing,
Yeah.
And at a large scale, that means something. An individual game, it's not a big deal, but at a large scale, I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, that's great. I love the positive spin on this. So sometimes you can get kind of heated when you're in a competitive moment and things aren't necessarily going well, but there's a lot of value in bringing people together and getting that connection with this shared experience.
And it's not that it's really the same thing as more traditional sports. Soccer is a great example, right? People get very competitive around when their country's team is playing another country's team, but really they're all there because they love watching this shared event, right? And they both love. Everybody loves the game, and that's a beautiful thing. We don't respect that enough these days.
So I wanted to ask you, following up on this, these games are able to build community and these human relationships. How can we in the SIGGRAPH computer graphics expert community play a role in supporting this value and creating more community?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, actually. So today, right now, we're all communicating using visuals online in real time, using many of the same technologies that esports streamers use. And it's working great right now because it's, at the moment at least, just you and I speaking. But as we're probably all aware, as you start communicating in larger and larger groups using these kinds of technologies online, it becomes more and more awkward. And I could go on at some length. I actually do research on this, on how the tools we have don't serve us well as we, the visual tools we have as we begin communicating in larger groups. And there's a lot of work for us to do in trying to enable rich human communication with our visuals. SIGGRAPH is very visually oriented. And so, for example, there's a new kind of display that I imagine most people haven't heard of yet, called a light field display, that lets you see an object like another person from many different angles. And one of the things that's missing from today's tools for visual communication online is support for shared gaze, right? So when it's two people, it's not a big issue. But when there are many people, everybody gets the same view of each person. And so we don't know if they're attending to us or if they're speaking to us, right? And so there's a lot of research to be done just in that. For example, how do we begin delivering eye contact, supporting eye contact when we communicate online?
So you're talking about this, right now, if I look in the camera, I'm looking directly at you. But say there were a third person in this meeting and I wanted to look at that person and communicate to you that I'm looking at that other person. There's no way for us to accomplish that in this particular platform.
That's right. And most platforms today don't do that. I mentioned a light field display. That's one possible way that it might be supported, so that a given display, as you move your head around, it supports 3D viewing and 3D display of an object or of a person. And so that would be one potential way in which we might be able to communicate with eye contact. Most engineers, I think SIGGRAPH is probably unique in this respect, different in this respect, don't appreciate how important nonverbal communication is, right? And they think that all you really need is a single view of a person, maybe of their face, and some audio, and we're good to go. But there's a lot that's left out of with just that feature set. A lot that's left out that is a crucial part of human communication. And there's this term that exists out there called Zoom fatigue. You might have heard. Just refers to the fact that you get tired. You seem to get tired more quickly when you're communicating, especially with groups online. And it's because your job, the task of communication, is just so much harder. Everything that your body is evolved to do to support communication is just all those pieces, all the elements of that job are harder because the tools aren't providing the cues that you naturally expect.
Yeah. That's for like a person-to-person meeting. If I could bring it back to esports slightly, when you're in a game, you're controlling a virtual character in a virtual environment, and you're able to like position and orient your character to kind of communicate where your attention is currently placed, right? And so some of this nonverbal communication is built into the mechanics of these esports games. And so in that sense, it gives you both a more rich experience because you've got these, this sort of richer presence in that virtual world, but then you're also removing a bit of the human element because you don't necessarily have the video of each other's faces to look at.
Yeah. I think especially in esports, there's a role for communicating through avatars. But when it comes to the primary function being human communication, I'm pretty skeptical of the avatar. I think that there's a lot of information, and we already have a good technology for capturing our faces and delivering and broadcasting that to other people. And I'm hesitant to leave that behind. I think that's pretty good.
Yeah, I guess it depends what information you're trying to communicate. In the game, you're trying to communicate information about the game. And
that's
so it's
right.
very effective for that purpose. And
that's
that
right.
type of information.
In the game, there's certainly a role for communicating through some sort of character or avatar. Yeah.
It doesn't discount any of the video conference, in-person meeting stuff. That's important for a whole bunch of human productivity too.
Sure. Yeah, but streaming uses esports streaming uses the same conferencing technology. So
yeah. Well, cool. Let's see. We're getting pretty far in here. What let's see. So as we celebrate 50 years of SIGGRAPH conferences this year, this will be the 50th year that there is a SIGGRAPH conference. Can you share any predictions about what's on the horizon for gaming, or where do you see it heading next?
Sure. So as I mentioned, the history of SIGGRAPH and to a large extent the history of gaming or graphics research for gaming is, as I mentioned, been a history of making the images better, whatever that means, but making the images better. And I think that actually I was there when this happened over 10 years ago now at SIGGRAPH in LA. George Lucas was the keynote speaker. And at one point in there, I don't remember the exact quote, he said, you know, we're basically done. We have all the tools we need to make movies. So,
did you say that was 10 years ago?
Yes. Yeah, I can find the quote for you. And he said, we've got everything we need. And of course, you know, the community kept going. But I think that was telling, right? And I think that my prediction and my hope actually is that SIGGRAPH will start paying more attention to all the other aspects, especially the temporal aspects and the interactive aspects of supporting the supporting use of imagery, of visual display. So I would like to see us develop, for example, a really strong method or rationale for deciding when to make the image better versus when to finish the image now, so that the user or the player knows learns what they need to know to accomplish their task or, you know, play well. That's one example. And I think that, like I mentioned, I'd be interested in your opinion too, but I think that we're beginning to see that in gaming as well. A lot of games are beginning to focus more on compelling play than on really amazing imagery. And I think Nintendo, for example, has always been a good illustration of that. Yeah. Their games are never at the cutting edge of visuals, but they're amazingly compelling.
Yeah. I guess whenever anybody sets out to make a game, they kind of have to choose where they're going to put their investment in. And so sometimes they'll focus on the interaction, the interface. Sometimes they might focus more on the rendering technique. Sometimes they might focus more on the plots or story.
Yeah, and to bring it back to SIGGRAPH, like I say, I think historically the conference has been very focused on filmmaking, and I would like to see it more focused on interactive applications and games, especially. I think that probably is, honestly speaking, where most of the opportunity lies, right? Even if you think about all the stuff going on in AI and machine learning these days, I don't think that in film, AI and machine learning will be really useful, but I think its most compelling application will be in gaming and other interactive applications where we need to make characters that move and look convincing in real time, and that act like convincing characters, like play a role. And I think that is probably the most promising and interesting application of machine learning, the interactive side of it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So I have a question from the audience. So it's esports indeed has potential. However, I'm interested in what your thoughts are on the cheating and hacking side when it comes to this field.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Cheating and hacking. So that exists both in esports and in gaming more broadly. I hadn't thought about it much. Do you have any thoughts, Joseph?
I mean, not much more than the obvious. Yeah.
I mean, it's just like, I would say, like any traditional sport. So anybody who's cheating, it sort of ruins, especially if it becomes widespread. it ruins the experience and the value of the game for everybody. So while I understand the often the motivation, right? It certainly is to win, but often it's just to be a little different. On the other hand, like how we were talking about earlier, the sports flourish when there's a shared understanding and a shared set of rules about how to compete. So that really what differentiates one player from another is their skill, right? Not their unique advantage because they're doing something nobody else has figured out how to do. And so I understand, and I think there is a reasonable justification for companies trying to enforce a certain method of play among all players. And I would also say, though, that I understand the drive for exploration, experimentation, and tinkering. And I think there are some environments today, like Roblox and Minecraft, that support that, and in which some gaming does exist. And I would be really excited to see more environments like that. Even in traditional sports, there are arenas where a certain amount of variation is tolerated and even encouraged, right? So for example, in racing, car racing, there are certain classes where there are constraints, but within those constraints, you're allowed to modify your car freely within those constraints.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting, right? Becomes a new arena for competition. It would be fun to see that sort of thing going on in esports more.
Yeah, where you can get some more customization or tuning.
Yes, customization, tuning, modding, right?
Yeah, I do think there are a few places where that kind of stuff happens. Custom games have been custom matches have been around for a long time. They don't, and on occasion, things from some of the most popular custom games can be adapted into the mainstream games. And for instance, Dota was originally a mod for Warcraft 3, and it became kind of the biggest MOBA in the world. As sort of just a mod for another game.
That's right. I'd forgotten about that.
Yeah. I think Counter-Strike was even a mod to Half-Life before it caught on as its own thing.
Right. And so I would say that's a great point, and it supports, it provides evidence that gaming should nurture that kind of creativity with intent, because it grows the industry.
I have another question here from the audience. This person seems to have observed that I work on esports research at NVIDIA.
Okay.
It is wondering about the process to apply for that type of a position with a computer science and gaming background. So, I can respond to that a little bit. I think, it's sort of about how to get into a career in the gaming space kind of broadly. There's lots of paths to that. Learning about games and starting to work on games and kind of creating a viable resume to show that you have the interest and you have some experience thinking and working on those topics is probably the best way to get there. I was sort of fortunate that I was already at NVIDIA working on virtual and augmented reality technologies, and then we sort of saw esports growing as a field and decided, we really need to do some esports research. And I had already expressed an interest to that to other people at the company. So I kind of lucked into my own position. And Ben, I know you've had quite a number of students that you've helped graduate and find jobs at various places in industry. I wonder if you have anything to say to students who might be looking for this type of a career.
Sure. I don't actually work at NVIDIA. I collaborate a lot with folks like you at NVIDIA. So to the extent that you're interested in working at NVIDIA, I would say the opportunities are very broad there. I have students who have become sort of hybrid researcher developers, sort of development, in terms of the D side of R&D, and they work in between game developers and the research team at NVIDIA, helping turn research innovations into real product, essentially. And my experience with those people attaining that sort of success has been that you need to demonstrate some real research success while you're still at the university, and then those successes need to be, compelling and interesting. I don't think you need to be like a superstar. I mean, that would certainly help, but I don't think you need to be a superstar researcher, who's gonna start getting, best researcher of the year awards and those sorts of things. But the more of a sort of portfolio of interesting techniques that you can show that you've developed and demonstrated, mostly, especially for these sort of development D and R&D jobs, you need to demonstrate a lot of competency with working at that sort of bleeding edge with those emerging tools. And so whatever you can do in your academic career to develop those skills, put out those interesting results, that's the best way to show that you're ready to work at NVIDIA and to work at similar jobs in other places in the industry. A lot of companies these days are building this similar sort of research capacity in their team. So I think the opportunities are much broader than that. As far as the esports goes, I think NVIDIA, as usual, is ahead of the curve in that. The idea of esports research and teams doing it is still pretty rare, but I think that if you qualify yourself for that, I think that you'll be well qualified, maybe even better qualified to find a position in industry, because I think that somebody who's sort of ahead of the curve in that sense, right? Somebody who's well qualified to serve a need that a company doesn't already have capacity for, that's a great qualification. So I think you'll be very attractive.
Great. That's a great answer. Thanks for that perspective.
Yeah. Sure.
We've had a number of good questions. We're kind of running short on time, so I'm going to try to get to one more quick one here. From the audience, is it worth exploring research questions pertaining to a small number of players, for example, pros, or is the current direction for esports research more with the average player in mind?
You want to take that, or should I take that, Joseph?
I would love your thoughts if you have some.
Okay. I think both are interesting. Personally, right now, I'm much more interested in research that supports development of expertise, both in gaming and more broadly in computer use. So most people, I'll be brief, but this is a story I often tell. Most people know that Doug Engelbart developed the mouse, and they're all familiar with the mouse. Everybody uses mice. And that was a huge contribution he made that helped novices begin to learn how to use computers, made it a lot easier for them to use computers at the beginning. But he was always frustrated throughout his career because he also developed a lot of tools and techniques for supporting the development of expertise in computer use. And he would use a metaphor. He would say, the mouse is like a tricycle. It helps you get going, but you wouldn't bring that tricycle to the bicycle race, right? And so I think esports is a great opportunity to study how to build bicycles for computer users, right? How do we help them develop expertise, become the best they can be? And it's not just a question for esports. There are a lot of other applications where that last 3 to 1% is really the crucial difference between success and failure. And that's my own focus at the moment.
Great. Thanks for that answer. Since we're about out of time, any final thoughts you'd like to share with the audience?
Sure. I just continuing on that last thought. I think that esports is a really unique confluence of computer users and competition, which makes it a unique opportunity to study in research the development of expertise. So there's that, and I think that's a really unique direction for researchers to go, and a really unique opportunity that esports represents for researchers. And then more broadly, I think esports is a great opportunity for SIGGRAPH to begin an interesting pivot toward supporting interactivity in the use of its visuals. I think, maybe not completely like George Lucas thinks, but I think that we've done most of the work we need to do in making really compelling imagery. And we have still have a lot to do in making that imagery available to the users and the players when they need it. So I would urge folks and future researchers to bear down on that problem.
Great. Thank you. That's a great answer. Great advice for everyone. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this webinar, and a huge thank you to Ben for joining me in this discussion. If you want to listen to the presentation again, look out for the recording. It will be up on the YouTube channel very soon. And finally, don't forget to register for SIGGRAPH. It's going to take place in Los Angeles the 6th through 10th of August. So you can access exciting games related content that we have planned, including Ben's workshop. Yep. And the gaming session, that tournament, along with hundreds and hundreds of other innovative projects, installations, and research. And I'd like to wish everyone a great day. Thanks
Thank
again,
you.
Ben.
It was a joy. Bye.